Hi, everyone. This is Jennifer Weiss with the Climate Action Reserve, and I'm happy to welcome all of you to this webinar on California climate policy. This is a virtual presentation of what is actually one of our flagship sessions at the North American Carbon World Conference. Many of you may know that the traditional presentation of the conference was canceled this year, but we've continued to present content from the conference under the NACW Virtual Series umbrella. So before we jump into the content of this webinar, I'd like to just take a moment to thank the sponsors and exhibitors of what would have been the in-person conference. Without their support and the support of others in the NACW community, we wouldn't be able to host our long-running conference. So I mentioned that this California climate policy topic is a long-running session that we've hosted at the conference, and we've been very fortunate to have Peter Miller moderate this session, and we're very honored to have him join us today as the moderator, but on a virtual stage. Peter is the director of the Climate and Clean Energy Program with NRDC. I will also introduce our other panelists, Matt Botto, who is the Assistant Division Chief from the Industrial Strategies Division at the California Air Resources Board, and Jenny Lester Moffitt is the Undersecretary at the California Department of Food and Agriculture. Our third panelist is Nguyen Tarek. She is the Deputy Director of Climate in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research. And unfortunately, Nguyen Tara is having some technical difficulties. That's one of the reasons why we're just a little bit late in starting this. Technical difficulties seem to pop up at the most inopportune moment. So we are hoping that she'll be able to join us shortly. And if she does, we will introduce her at that point. But for now, I'm going to turn this over to Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, Jennifer, and welcome everybody. It's disappointing that we can't all gather in person at the annual conference, and I very much looking forward to seeing everybody back at that conference when we can gather together, hopefully next year. But thank you for coming to this virtual panel today. So order of operations, I'm going to give Jenny and Matt a moment to just provide some introductory comments. We're going to go through a couple questions and let them both respond. And then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So you might start thinking about things you want to ask our panelists. We're going to continue to hope that Nguyen Tara is able to join us. Particular thanks to her for wrestling with IT problems. We've all been there, and that's perhaps the most challenging task of all. And then thanks to all of you for showing up. So let's start, Jenny, with you. If you could just give us a couple comments about what you're up to these days and your thoughts on this important issue.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And it's a pleasure to be on this panel again. I think this is my third time with you on the panel. So it's great to be here and to be back with you all virtually. A little bit different scene than San Francisco or Los Angeles for sure. Yeah, so we've been, as many of you know, we've been quite busy at the state in climate policy, especially in the past month. The governor has announced a couple executive orders. I'm going to talk about one briefly as it dovetails into agriculture and the work that we're doing in agriculture on climate smart ag. So 2 weeks ago, the governor announced an executive order on natural and working lands, really on nature and on natural climate solutions, both for biodiversity as well as for the climate crisis. So the announcement that the governor announced on a walnut farm really was, I would say, celebrated by many as it established a state goal of conserving at least 30% of California's land and coastal waters by 2030 to address biodiversity and climate. And it also established and launched a biodiversity collaborative at the state, as well as elevates the role of natural and working lands as a key pillar of our state's climate strategy. The governor, through his executive order, directed us as state agencies to identify immediate actions to scale up natural climate solutions, develop a comprehensive long-term strategy, as well as begin working as when the Air Resources Board does begin working on the scoping plan to work on integrating natural and working lands more into the scoping plan in the next version. So it's been very exciting. Agriculture is a big part of that climate solution. Our roughly 70,000 farmers and ranchers have been stewarding the lands for generations, both working with nature as well as producing food. Everything from our rice farmers who are producing not only rice that feeds the world, but also providing habitat for over 230 species of wildlife. And at the same time, almond farmers throughout the state are planting thousands of acres of cover crop for soil health, but also bee forage as well. So we have a suite of climate smart agriculture programs at the state of California that are funded through several different funding mechanisms, but they really work hand in hand as far as, it can't really be a one only solution, it's a yes and solution. So everything from water efficiency programs to equipment engine replacement programs to dairy methane programs to healthy soils. We have that suite of programs at the state that we've continued to work on implementing as well, because it's important that we have climate policies, but it's also important that we work with industry on implementing climate practices as well. This is really important because climate change deeply affects ag. We'll get to that more, I know, later on, but ag is also not only deeply affected, but definitely part of the solution as well. So I'm excited to be here to talk more about that.
Thank you, Jenny, and I very much appreciate the yes and approach to dealing with this complex issue that we face. Matt, I'm going to hand it to you with you had some introductory comments.
Sure, thank you, Peter, and thanks everybody for joining us today. Very excited and happy to be on this panel. As Jennifer and Peter have mentioned, my name is Matthew Ottill. I'm the Assistant Division Chief at the California Air Resources Board for the Industrial Strategies Division, and so we focus on both climate policy, the development and implementation of the state's scoping plan that was required by AB 32, as well as some of the key programs that we use to hit our climate targets, such as cap and trade, the low carbon fuel standard, and various oil and gas and electricity measures. And, as Jenny mentioned, there's been some really exciting announcements over the last month coming from the governor and coming from our state agencies about where we need to go on the climate going forward. And, we're going to talk a little bit about this in a minute, but this is really coming on the heels of the very real effects of climate change that we are all experiencing right now, and the need to really, double our resolve on addressing climate change. And for many of you too, I know, we talked about some of the technical issues about doing these remote meetings. You may have seen the door pop up just a few minutes ago. There's also the personal side of it. My 4-year-old came running in and gave me something as a matter of good luck. It's a little slap bracelet. I don't know if you remember these things. And it just so happens that he's just short enough that he can run in under the camera. So you might see the door swing open and like a little head bobbing around in the background. And that's just another part of working on these things and doing it remotely and trying to make progress while we're all at home. So appreciate everybody's patience with both the technical issues and the personal ones.
Well, thank you so much, and it's certainly true that the switch over to all these Zoom meetings has given us all insight to each other's lives, and we're all in this together as humans as much as more than as a professional position. So very much appreciate that. So let me start off with a couple questions. This summer's fires, which I think anybody who was in California was unable to escape, long and hard for many of us. Summer's fires made clear that the threat of climate change doesn't stop at the state's borders, our neighbors to the north in particular. Can you talk about ongoing cooperation, coordination with our western neighbors, and about opportunities to expand those efforts? Without getting into the upcoming election, can you also talk about the need and value for cooperation with the federal government? Jenny, do you want to start with that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so you know, certainly as an arid state, fires are part of our natural system, but not to the extreme nature that we've experienced this year and we've experienced in the past few years, and it's just, you know, exponentially getting worse. At CDFA and in agriculture, we have and we maintain a very strong partnership with the United States Department of Agriculture through our programs. So in partnership with climate research and research on different quantification. So for our Healthy Soils program, the quantification tool that we use is called Comet Planner, which was developed in partnership with USDA as well as Colorado State University. That tool is a really important one. It not only provides us the quantification that we need on greenhouse gas emission reductions, but it also is a great tool for farmers and ranchers. So we've partnered with many other states in partnership with our U.S. Climate Alliance, as well as other state partnerships in sharing that tool and working with others on implementing that. We also, of course, work collectively on increasing implementation of programs like the NRCS EQIP program and other programs that are part of management practices overall that are really important for both climate adaptation and mitigation. But really, the biggest partnership is on disasters. And so USDA Farm Service Agency, right now, actually, as we're working on some of the recovery, specifically in up north in the northern fires, on making sure that we continue to get animal feed and forage, or to animals who've lost their forage and those sorts of things. So recovery and response is really important. But then also on things like crop insurance and insurance. I think we've all heard a lot of the stories about what has happened in the wine industry this year with smoke taint, and the effect and the damage that the fires have caused to that. So crop insurance and those sorts of things are really important as well. And we've actually, for the wine, because there is wine all the way up from California, Oregon, and Washington and into Vancouver, we have banded together all 4 of our entities to work on expanding things like lab capacity for smoke taint and stuff like that. So partnerships are key. We can't in California do it alone. We really do rely on our Western state partnerships for sure, as well as our federal partnerships. Disasters impact us all. They impact not only our farmers, but our farm workers and our communities, and they've just been devastating for the state.
Great, thank you, Jenny. Matt, how about how we cooperate and collaborate with neighbors in the industrial sector? Any thoughts?
Yeah, and then I was going to talk a little bit more broadly too. That, you know, when I think about this, I think it's easy to kind of focus on the negative, you know, in terms of, you know, what the U.S. is doing or isn't doing as a whole, and that's just quite honestly just a distraction when you look at what's actually happening, the level of interest we get from other states and other jurisdictions, both, you know, within the U.S. and outside of the U.S. It's very clear that there is a strong push and interest to take action on climate change, you know, particularly across the West Coast and particularly across the world. And so, you know, CARB and a number of other state agencies are working really closely through a number of mechanisms and other avenues to have partnerships in the U.S. And so just on a couple of these, you know, things like working with the U.S. Climate Alliance, working with the Under 2 Coalition, and, you know, just personally working with them on, you know, methane reduction rules and how do we reduce methane emissions from oil and gas and in the industrial sector across different jurisdictions. Yeah, the ICAP looking at places to push forward with carbon pricing in other jurisdictions, and just, you know, of course, the Pacific Coast Collaborative, where, you know, we're seeing interest from Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, to do things that California has really, you know, set the stage for, you know, renewable energy standards, low carbon fuel standards, zero emission vehicles and infrastructure, you know, mandates within other jurisdictions. And they're looking to California. They want to learn from what we've done, and they want to look at how they can take the programs that we've implemented here in California and model those and implement them in their own jurisdictions. And to Jenny's point, there are willing and valuable partners on the federal government side too, if you go just a little bit deeper. So she mentioned some of the work with USDA, and I was going to talk about that as well in terms of on our natural working land side, when we look about how can we pull in ag and natural working lands as a part of the climate solution. The NRCS and USDA have been really valuable in helping to define the types of conservation strategies that we can deploy on our natural working lands, and helping us to scientifically assess those for California crops. They focus nationwide, but they have spent a considerable amount of time working with us on specific California crops. We also work with USDA and the Forest Service on forest carbon accounting, and looking at how do we assess what the health and carbon storage of our forest is. And that's a really valuable partnership that we have with them, given how much of the state's land is federally owned and managed, and what we're trying to do on bringing natural working lands into it, being part of the climate solution for California. And then we also, just to give another example, I've been working with JPL and NASA. They're doing some really amazing things on remote sensing. And this, can apply to both industrial emissions as well as, looking at land use, and also, carbon storage throughout the state's landscapes. And that remote sensing data and that information that JPL and NASA are pulling together and doing is something that we're, very happy with, and that we're partnering with them on. So there are willing partners on the federal side and other jurisdictions that really paint a really positive picture. And I can say, just from us, from our side, I feel like we're constantly, spending time talking to these, other jurisdictions and these partners, and kind of working through the specifics of programs, and they're, really serious about taking action. And so it's a really actually positive story. And, I do want to mention too that there are things that I think California has done just recently that is going to push these jurisdictions, and also be a good model going forward for additional action. Jenny mentioned the biodiversity EO that the governor signed just a few weeks ago. There was also the we're calling it the zero emission vehicle executive order that was about a month ago that came forward, where we put a marker down that we're going to have 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2035 for passenger vehicles. And that's an aggressive target, but it's something that's going to really push California's vehicle fleet and industry. And then that's going to be something that the rest of the states and nation can benefit from as the technology evolves, the costs come down on that technology, and we demonstrate that it is possible to cut your emissions from the transportation sector through electrification and through zero emission vehicles in a big way. So I just look forward to being able to continue that collaboration with our partners, and look at all the positive signs in terms of the amount of interest in the efforts going on, both subnationally and outside of the states.
Great, thank you, Matt. It's encouraging to hear of California's continued leadership and the value that provides, but also of the interest in collaboration and partnership from across the country, across the world. So thank you for that. Next question. So back in the day, I've been at this for a while. The focus of climate action and our advocacy at NRDC was overwhelmingly on mitigation rather than on adaptation. How can we reduce emissions? Because at some point in the future, we're going to face this real problem. Well, we no longer have that luxury. Clearly, the impacts are here with us today. Can you talk about how you approach the need for measures to promote resilience and adaptation in the face of climate change, and how that fits into our overall climate strategy? Jenny, I think you wanted to particularly touch on this one.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so key. I mean, we know in a land-based industry, we see already, and we've seen the impacts of climate change in agriculture. A recent University of California assessment that came out found that by the end of, by the mid-century, rising temperatures are going to lead to yield losses in key crops by up to 40% in some of our major agricultural crops in the state. So we see that with decline in things like what we call winter chill in a lot of our crops, where we need dormancy to really reset the crops each year, from erratic pest pressures, changes in weather, erratic rain or wind events throughout the growing season. We're seeing those effects of climate change happen right now. And so really, as we look at programs and as we're thinking about both the mitigation as well as the adaptation measures, they go hand in hand. And I think one of the more pressing programs that we have that really addresses both is our Healthy Soils program. So through our Healthy Soils program, and actually I'll just say generally Healthy Soils practices, because they don't need to be funded through our program. They can be funded through USDA. They can be funded entirely by and implemented entirely by the grower or the rancher. But practices like grazing, in prescribed grazing, for instance, in rangeland, we know just not only the benefits of prescribed and managed grazing on building grasses and deeper rooted grasses to build soil carbon holding, which is of course great for mitigation, but at the same time, that's important, and we see, especially as we just finished talking about fires, it's a huge adaptation measure as well, because we're managing those grasses. We're growing grasses that are more natural and native to California, which are more fire resistant, fire resilient. They bounce back quicker after fires. And then of course, as we're managing that grazing land in a much more prescribed way, we're also able to build water holding capacity, which I would say is also a key adaptation measure, especially here in the state of California, where we're very arid, and the more that we can capture water in the soil, the better that is. There was actually the USGS, through the California's fourth climate assessment, came out with a report about 2 years ago that showed that a 1% increase in soil organic matter in the state's 25 million acres of ag land would lead to 1.5 million acre feet annually of water holding capacity. So that's the size of a medium-sized reservoir in the state that we can actually hold in our soils through management practices. There's other things on croplands. Compost application, of course, is not only important for mitigating and sequestering carbon in our cropland, but it also, and rangeland as well, but it also has the added benefit of all of our other state goals, which are really about reducing methane at landfills and moving organic materials out of landfills and into things like compost, animal feed, and those sorts of things, where we're really starting to upcycle that really important nutrient as well. Cover crops, hedgerows, all of those different practices in healthy soils are really key, not only to sequestering carbon, which is important in that mitigation concept that you talked about, but then also in really adapting and building a more water resilient, more climate resilient, more pest resilient state, building more biodiversity with hedgerows and cover crops as well. So it just really does have all these multiple benefits that we talk about, that is really important for the state.
Thank you, Jenny. It's exciting to hear about those synergistic opportunities that really bring the industry forward as partners. And I very much was struck by the statistic of how, you know, even a modest increase in soil carbon can help us in a number of different ways. So thank you for that. Matt, did you have what can you tell us about how to have an integrated climate strategy?
Sure, yeah, and probably this won't come as much of a surprise from me being a carb, but you know, I have to say that, you know, the first and foremost biggest priority is addressing the source of the problem. And so, you know, we are always going to be working as hard as we can to address our ongoing, you know, concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and, you know, minimizing and eliminating emissions that are going into the atmosphere, because that is what has gotten us to this point that we're at today. And, you know, we obviously, you know, see important work to happen in kind of addressing the effects of climate change, but we want to really get at the source of the problem first. And so, you know, what we're doing at CARB is, you know, looking at our long-term climate goals. And right now, for us, that is what does carbon neutrality mean for the state? Can we achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century? Can we, and by mid-century, I mean 2045? And how do you define carbon neutrality for the state, and given kind of its really diverse sources and sinks of emissions? And so we are continuing to focus on mitigation and looking at how do we really reduce our emissions down to a level where we can achieve some form of carbon neutrality by 2045. And that process is something that we are going to be embarking upon starting next year in a really meaningful way with our scoping plan process. That being said, I do want to kind of put on a different hat for a second. So before I had this role in the Industrial Strategies Division, I worked really closely with Jenny and others on the climate investments, the California Climate Investments Program. And through that program, which has a specific kind of statutory focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it also has an opportunity to blend both adaptation and mitigation together in a way that is different than CARB's more mitigation-focused programs that come out of the scoping plan. And so, what we were able to do with that climate investments program, and Jenny gave you, an indication of it with Healthy Soils, is look at how do you put in place the strategies that both have mitigation and resiliency and adaptation benefits, and how do you weigh those? And so, there, beyond the benefits that we can get from Healthy Soils practices and on-farm conservation, the climate investments program was also able to do things like evaluate the employment benefits that come from the investments that they were making, whether it be in forestry or waste diversion or transportation. And those investments are in the types of strategies that we need to have a decarbonized economy. So as we look at kind of organics diversion, for instance, what kind of employment benefits come from the implementation of anaerobic digestion from organics waste, or employment benefits from energy efficiency or renewable energy projects. And that's an economic resiliency strategy for the state to really look at what types of jobs can be created from the transition to a decarbonized economy that we're instituting now. We also, through that effort, looked at things like cooling, the effect that the urban canopy has on building energy use, and the urban heat island effect. And so, we were able to look at, okay, we're going to sequester carbon from tree planting activities, but we're also going to get cooler buildings and less demand and reliance on energy consumption for air conditioning. And so there are these opportunities to look at climate mitigation strategies through the additional lens of the types of adaptation benefits the state needs. And those are just a couple of examples. We've got plenty more. But those are the strategies that I think, when it comes to public investment and public focus are really, going to be important long-term for the state to look at, while we also push forward on our strong mitigation programs. And I see Nuantara has joined us. You made it.
Yes, thank you, Matt. And I think it was very helpful and informative to point out the importance of integrating economic resilience is not in addition to climatic and environmental resilience. We need integrated strategies to address the state's economy as well. And yes, we have been joined by Nuantara. Thank you so much. And I think that's a good demonstration of the state's resilience and persistence. Thanks for working through those IT issues. We've all been there, so very much appreciate you joining us. And I want to give you the opportunity to just introduce yourself and give a couple opening remarks.
Your mic might not be working.
Looks like you're still on mute.
Okay.
There we go.
Now, okay. This is, yes, a test in my own personal adaptability here. So apologies to everyone for joining so late. I don't need to bore you with the technical issues that just converged here. but yes, I'm very excited to be here. I have been listening in on the phone, so I've been able to track a little bit of the conversation, which was great. So for just a quick introduction, I'm Nuantara Key. I'm Deputy Director for Climate Resilience in the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and very excited to be on the panel here with my colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. I think, recognizing I'm kind of jumping in the middle here of this conversation, I would add just a couple things to what both Jenny and Matt walked through in terms of the resilience and adaptation work that we're doing. I think, absolutely agree with everything they said. I think I would add maybe a couple key points from our vantage point at OPR is that while we are absolutely, as Matt was saying, committed and committed to ambitious emissions reduction goals and targets, we also recognize that we are locked into a certain amount of change just because of the emissions that are already out there. So we really need to move to this accelerated, integrated approach on climate, which balances both adaptation and mitigation. We're already seeing the impacts across communities, as has already been discussed. So just really, we're really prioritizing and trying to find solutions to both mitigate and adapt at the same time, and in an accelerated manner. A couple things that are priorities for us as we're thinking about our adaptation and resilience agenda is really recognizing that climate impacts only exacerbate existing inequalities and inequities in communities. So they will only make worse the conditions that are on the ground, and that all our, as with our climate mitigation strategies, all our adaptation and resilience approaches also need to be centered in an equity lens and focus to really make sure that we're not exacerbating or perpetuating those inequities. And we have a great opportunity to really be thinking strategically about how we drive on our equity and adaptation and resilience and mitigation goals together, recognizing that's a tall order. But we have seen the impacts of climate across the state and have definitely seen disparate impacts. Just a couple examples here. I heard Jenny mention the fourth climate change assessment. Another report from the fourth assessment really highlighted and exemplified or highlighted that African Americans in Los Angeles are nearly twice as likely to die from a heat wave than other Angelenos. We also have seen recently reports coming out around the disparate impacts of extreme heat on Black women who are already almost 2.5 times more likely than white women to have children with low birth rate, and there's a very significant impact that extreme heat has on those outcomes and conditions as well. So again, really recognizing the need to act now, since we're already locked into change, but also maintaining our commitment to emissions reductions. I think one of the ways, and I'll pause here, I'll after this last statement, because I think we'll get to it a little bit more, is that we are really thinking about how we invest and drive on our climate finance agenda and strategy to really be able to drive resources to address the impacts that we're seeing in an integrated way. So happy to talk more about our climate finance strategy that we've been working on as a key component to our work ahead. So with all that, I will hand it back to you. Thanks again, and sorry again to be late.
Thank you, Nuantara, and very much appreciate those comments. But let's then go into that issue about climate finance. The scale of the investment that we need to address the climate crisis is sobering. It's enormous. And while we've got the opportunity to have some public revenues, notably from the California cap and trade auction revenues, very substantial in the billions, it's nowhere near what's needed, and private investment is going to have to fill the gap. Can you talk about how we can finance that investment, where it's going to come from, and how do we deal with the risk that is going to be at the forefront of those private investors? Matt, I think you had in particular maybe wanted to lead on this one.
Sure, happy to, and welcome any any more feedback from the other panels too. And so I think, Peter, you teed it up nicely. We are not going to be able to, pay our way out of the climate debt that we have created as a state agency and or, even with our local agency partners. This is something that we absolutely need funding and support from, the entire state, private industry, as well as public funding. And the funding that has come through on the climate investment side, it's north of 12 billion now, and that's a substantial amount of funds to be able to support climate mitigation and as well as adaptation strategies. But like I said, it's just not going to be enough. And so, from my perspective, where we're looking at is how do we leverage the work that we're doing on long-term climate planning. So looking at, post 2030 targets like 2045 carbon neutrality, planning and, putting forward the scenarios of what carbon neutrality could look like for the state, and then following up that planning with, action on our programs to create some market certainty for investors and for others about the types of strategies that we think are going to be really pivotal to being carbon neutral by 2045. So that the business community has some certainty and can make some decisions on investments that help us get there. And so how that's materializing now, and we're seeing it now, are through things just, like what just happened last month with the zero emission vehicle executive order. I mean, that was a very clear, strong signal that the state is all in on zero emission vehicles, and that we want that innovation here in California, and that we have really strong partners from the auto manufacturers that are really pushing zero emission vehicles as well. And we're going to obviously follow up that executive order with the implementation at CARB. We're also seeing it in terms of the types of fuels that are coming to market now. So California has our low carbon fuel standards, and over the last few months we've seen announcements from some of the major oil producing companies that they're switching over to things like renewable diesel production and biodiesel. And so these are the types of investments as they move from traditional diesel and gasoline production into alternative fuels, and doing it here in California, that are very important for the state for meeting our long-term carbon goals. And seeing those types of investments coming as on the heels of the kind of the policies and the programs that California's put in place are what's really needed. And so as we look towards carbon neutrality, what we want to be able to do is say, this is what the future looks like for California, whether it be zero emission vehicles, a diverse fuel mix, decarbonized buildings and appliances, healthy and managed and sustained forests and natural working lands, and put those signals out there to really give that clarity to the broader stakeholder community, to private business about where we're going as a state, so they can make decisions that will help us get there.
That's very helpful, Matt. I think you've really highlighted the importance of far-sighted and consistent leadership from the state. And we've been fortunate to have a series of governors over decades and agency leaders who have maintained a consistent policy direction that's allowed us to provide some certainty for investors over the long term, which is what they need.
I think we're very fortunate. We're on the third administration now that is very climate conscious and pushing climate strategies. And for the 13 years that I've been at CARB, it has been a consistent push, and I think that's exactly why we've been able to make a lot of the progress that we've made so far. So
great, thank you. Jenny, did you want to talk about climate finance?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I will say is especially as we've launched our programs that have been funded through GGRF, it's been very important to us to not only incentivize direct practices, but then also to use that funding to leverage and to grow the network and the people and the knowledge base that's out there on climate on climate smart ag practices. So whether it is with our Healthy Soils program or our dairy methane programs or our water efficiency programs, for all of those, we've looked at demonstration projects, on the ground demonstration projects, building those train the trainers, implementing research on the ground that is then, the big focus is actually on field days, so that we're getting more growers who are becoming aware, or, being able to ask growers other questions, because farmer to farmer discussions, farmer to farmer information sharing is one of the most powerful ways that we can really, scale up these practices. So demonstration projects have been key. I think another thing, just as what Matt was talking about with really leveraging with investors, our dairy digester program is a really great example of how we've leveraged some funding, almost exponentially with investors in the private sector, not just on the investor side, but then also, as Matt talked about, on things like renewable fuels and being able to capture that methane from a digester, turn it in, put it into either transportation fuels or into the pipeline for renewable fuels. Those have been really important because they're really market levers, market mechanisms that we can use to really drive climate and mitigation measures and change in the industry. Another thing that we've very much been focused on in recent years is just in the food industry, especially, the incredible purchasing power that there is. So working with companies, we saw it during Climate Week last month, just the amount of announcements and goals that food companies have on going to zero emissions. That happens through partnerships with their supply chain. And so that purchasing power, working with those companies, having those companies use their purchasing power, hopefully paying for and incentivizing practices down to the grower level. That's always our goal, because these practices do have costs associated with it, but really leveraging the private sector, the power of purchasing, the supply chain, and really driving the change throughout the whole industry.
Great, thank you, Jenny. It's an important point about how we really are in an integrated economy, and it's important to transform the entire supply chain, and it can be driven from either end, from growers or from consumers, and hopefully there's some real convergence there. Thank you. Nuantara, do you have any responses to the question? What are your thoughts about how we really move forward on climate finance?
Yeah, so I would add that I think, building on Matt and Jenny's points, I think, and to your point too, of kind of having some regulatory certainty for the market is something that we, in the mitigation space, can learn from in the adaptation space as well, and is actually an area where we're spending a lot of attention right now. So recognizing, as both public and private entities are starting to think about transition risk, and recognizing the important role that California policy has played in creating that kind of market certainty on the transition side to a low carbon economy. I think we have a lot of work still to do on the physical risk side, and actually integrating physical risk into our investment decisions, and providing market certainty, but then also actually representing the actual risks that climate poses on our investments, both through the state as an asset, but also other investments that are made throughout the state through public and private sectors. So that is an area where we've spent a fair amount of time, especially over this last year, really thinking about how do we operationalize physical risk in our planning and investment decisions. And I want to highlight Executive Order N1919, which really charted out an ambitious approach, especially on the state asset side, calling for our Department of Transportation as well as our Department of General Services to align investments with climate goals, including physical climate risk. So that's been one area where we've been really taking a hard look, trying to figure out how we actually operationalize that. I think the other thing, I would have mentioned this earlier in the wildfire portion if I had been on, so just weaving it in here quickly. I think the wildfires, this probably goes without saying, over the last few years have really put in stark focus that climate as a financial risk, and recognizing, PG&E bankruptcy the first week of the Newsom administration, followed by ratings downgrading. We've spent $2 billion alone on campfire cleanup, not even touching recovery or rebuild. We are over budget, as I'm sure everyone in California already knows, on wildfire costs for this year alone significantly. So, these costs are real, and they're real to the state budget, they're real to local government budgets, and they have, actual implications in terms of our ability to continue to meet our the needs of our communities. So one of the ways that we're working to try to get ahead of that is actually to integrate that physical risk into our investment decisions. A couple recent announcements that also came out during Climate Week. One was that the state has signed on to the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, which is a public-private international initiative, really looking at and building a network and also suite of tools to be able to do this in investment decisions. So California is the first signatory to that coalition in the United States, which is wonderful. So we're just starting to engage there. The other thing that the governor also called for in Climate Week was the creation of a climate risk disclosure work group. So we're just starting to think through that and really thinking about how California can help set standards around how we're disclosing risk in investment and infrastructure investment decisions. And last thing I'll say here quickly is I think there's a really important, as we think about the role of the public sector, I think there's a really important role for government in this space, recognizing, much of the private sector may actually, in terms of actually integrating this, may be ahead of the public sector, excuse me. There's a really important role for government in making sure that those costs are borne in an equitable way, and that we're not, again, kind of creating and perpetuating existing economic inequities. So I'll pause there, hand it back to you now.
Well, that's thank you very much for those comments. It gives me pause to recognize how much, what a challenge it is in terms of, you're in the Office of Planning and Research, and what it means to try to integrate the climate risks we face, the physical risk, certainly fire comes to mind, but also sea level rise, heat waves. We've seen that in our energy sector this year. And that's certainly going to be a challenging effort. And you also noted, on top of that, trying to address some of the underlying structural problems, the inequities in the economy, at the same time as we're facing those other problems. So that's a challenging set of tasks, and thanks for taking those on. We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to encourage our audience members to type in some questions if they have them. I'd be glad to pick one or two we might have time for, but I wanted to throw it back, as we're waiting for that, I want to throw it back to our panelists and see if there's anything at the end of these panels. It's nice to have a little lightning round, and if there's anything, a point that you wanted to make, or that little project you're spending 5% of your time on that is going to be really big, but people haven't heard about yet, that you'd want to take the time to mention to our audience, now's the time to do it. While we wait for those questions. Anybody? Hands up. Matt.
I'm not going to let that opportunity go by. Yeah, I just want to flag for folks on this, on this session that we've got some big things coming up at CARB that are worth paying attention to. So just this week, actually yesterday, we released an update to our greenhouse gas emissions inventory from 2018. So we're continuing to show kind of how we're doing addressing climate change. And later this week, on Thursday and Friday, Cal EPA is holding a series of workshops that talk about how do we not just reduce emissions from the demand of fossil fuel, but also, what about the supply side? So what do we do when we're talking about the transition of traditional industries that are based off of fossil fuel into new sectors? And so they're holding a series of workshops on that later this week, and then into next month and next year, we are going to be focusing on how do we chart a path towards carbon neutrality, which is a very big deal, and it's something that is going to be done very publicly through the scope of my process. And so I look forward to being able to talk to the other panelists, as well as many of the folks in the audience, about how we hit carbon neutrality in 2045 with California's economy. And so those are some things that are coming up into the future, and I look forward to working with you on it.
Great, thank you. Nantara or Jenny, any highlights of upcoming events or things you're working on? Folks, stuff that you want to point out to the audience? Still waiting to hear from audience members on questions.
I would offer very quickly here that, I've highlighted two of the big things that we have going on around the coming out of Climate Week on the climate finance side. So definitely keep an eye out for some of the information around the risk disclosure work. Another area that we are working on now in our office, we have an advisory council that helps guide and inform our adaptation program and our work. And one of the big things we've been focusing on with them and will be carrying forward in the next few months is around how we develop metrics and indicators to track our progress on adaptation and resilience. We have a wealth of information on the climate mitigation side in terms of clear targets and goals. Adaptation is different. We're never going to have one single goal that we're working towards that we can quantify quite in the same way. But I think it is really important that we also be able to understand how we are doing and tracking our progress at meeting resilience and adaptation goals. So I know that's pretty kind of high level at this point, but it's something we're really focused on, and I think will help this state and hopefully our local partners as well better be able to prioritize resilience and adaptation in investment and policy decisions.
That's great, and I'll just emphasize how important that is, because when we talk about climate impacts, there's certainly impacts on the economy, but there's going to be real impacts on people, and the 40 million people that live in this state, and it'll be important to really be able to demonstrate that they're making their lives better, helping them to adapt and prosper through this. So appreciate that. We're just about out of time. Any last comments from the panelists? If not, I'll give you back a minute or two of your lives, and want to thank all of you for participating, taking the time to join us for this panel. I want to thank the Climate Reserve for hosting this, and thank our attendees for listening in. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks all.
Thank you.